All right, another player returning home in a roundabout way is Chris Paul. Chris Paul this week agreed to a one-year deal with the LA Clippers, his 21st season, and we believe likely his last season. We knew that Chris was looking to land a deal with a team in this area. It surprised me when he said a few weeks back that, all the stops he's made since LA, his family has stayed in the LA area.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't know that the entire time
for sure.
they had stayed while he was bouncing around. So you knew he wanted to be back either in LA. I think Phoenix was a potential landing spot. But he lands with the Clippers. He reunites with James Harden. Who would have thought that was going to happen? Former teammate in Houston. And he joins Bradley Beal and John Collins as new additions to this Clippers rotation. So Chris Paul was someone who played 82 games last year, Rachel. Started 82 games last year.
Yep.
What kind of impact do you think he has on the Clippers?
Yeah, I mean, just Chris Paul's family situation is interesting. When he got traded to Houston or went to Houston, I can't even remember at this point, he did move his whole family there. And they bought a house, and they 100% intended to just be there for the duration. And it was a little bit of a tough move for his kids, who are older than, say, Damian Lillard's kids and had to be pulled out of school and all of that stuff. And he got dealt from Houston, and he felt a very underhanded way. And suddenly all this that he had done was for nothing, and that his family had been through. And his wife is an incredibly accomplished and smart person who had her own life here in Los Angeles. And I think they just decided as a family, okay, I'm not going to have as much control over where I go. The reason Phoenix worked out with all of this was, that commute home from Phoenix to LA is not terrible. It's not like commuting back from the East Coast. But I think even now, I talked to him in a bunch of his last stops, even in San Antonio. He just said he was missing so much of the stuff that, you want to be there for as a father, because even if you can commute back and forth, like, you're not there some days. And he didn't want to miss it. Your kids are only at home once. And I think it's kind of cool, by the way, that Chris Paul is talking about that Damian Lillard is talking about that. It's interesting. Dwayne Wade published that book, Fatherhood, a few years back. And one thing he talked about is that in the NBA, when he came into the league, there was such a negative portrayal among NBA players of Black fatherhood. And, so-and-so has this many children by this many mothers and this, that, and the other. And one thing that Chris Paul and Dwayne Wade and LeBron James talked about as they all started to have kids was it was important to them to really be there for their kids. LeBron didn't have a father growing up. Chris Paul had the best father growing up. And for both of those reasons, they wanted to really be there for their children. And that Dwayne talked about in his book that he wanted to change that image for people by example in the NBA. And we have seen Chris, in this case, Dame, just so many guys make a big deal about wanting to be there for their children, even when they can earn millions of dollars somewhere else. I think that's pretty cool. And I think that that's a pretty big sea change from when you and I came into the league. And so it's nice to see Chris making that decision. And in terms of what he can do for the Clippers, I really think it's about orchestrating, the second team when he comes off the bench. Harden is masterful at that and underrated at this point, in my opinion. And that Chris can do the same thing with the second unit. I just think that's, I think that's going to be a huge asset. He and Ty Lue are going to work great together. And as you said, he's become a durable player now.
He has. And look, he still is a productive player. Shot 38% from three last season, 7.5 assists per game. Those are good numbers, even on a team that really wasn't going anywhere in San Antonio. Remarkable that he was willing to do that, to play all 82 games. I'm sure the Spurs would have been fine if he sat some games out down the stretch, did whatever he wanted as they were headed towards the bottom of the lottery, but he played all 82 games and was, productive for a player 40 years old and his 20th NBA season. Look, on paper, I really like this Clippers roster, right? Like, I think John Collins makes sense. Bradley Beal replacing Norman Powell makes sense. Chris Paul leading the second unit makes sense. But they've also added a lot of guys with egos, right? Like Chris Paul started last year. All 82 games. I'm sure there was a conversation with the Clippers about what his role is going to be. I'm sure of it. But you know this. It's one thing to have the conversation, one thing to see it manifest during a season. Same thing with Bradley Beal. Love the fit. Bradley Beal as a max level guy with a no trade clause, hated it. Bradley Beal on a 2-year, $11 million contract, love it. Or whatever that number is. Love that deal. Phenomenal for the Clippers. But Bradley Beal is used to being a starter. Bradley Beal chafed at, the idea of a reduced role in Phoenix. Again, certainly was a conversation between the Clippers and Bradley Beal about what his role is going to be. But, I look at this Clippers rotation and I'm thinking, if they're ever playing a fourth quarter with Chris Paul, James Harden, and Bradley Beal in the lineup, that team's going to lose.
Yeah.
They need to have Chris Dunn playing a lot of these minutes. Chris Dunn is the best defensive backcourt player that they have, one of the best defensive backcourt players in the entire league. So, is it going to be okay with Chris or Beal that they're sitting down the stretch in the fourth quarter when James Harden's playing alongside a Chris Dunn to make sure he had enough defense in that rotation? Does that worry you at all with this group? Because, Rachel, a lot of times, we've seen a lot of examples of teams that look really good on paper when they sign these guys that are veterans that are taking less money, and here they come into that mix. And I don't want to say more often than not, but at least half the time, I think it doesn't really work. It turns out the chemistry just doesn't mix.
Yeah, I think there's a couple factors here. First of all, I don't want to jinx anyone. I'm knocking on all the wood. Kawhi Leonard doesn't play full seasons anymore.
Yeah,
and
that's the ball game
issues.
right there. Kawhi's
and
health.
So if they can keep him healthy to the playoffs, which they did this past year and through the playoffs, that will involve him taking a bunch of games off. We just know that that's how it works with him and his injury management. So when you talk about lineups or starting lineups, or is there room for everyone, that is a pretty huge factor that some of the teams you're talking about didn't deal with, that the best player on the team isn't going to be there for a chunk of the season, and you just know that going in, and therefore sort of pieces move around. I also think we've seen depth is more important than it's ever been. The two teams that got to the finals were built on depth and needed that depth and beat other teams using that depth. So I don't think the Clippers feel they can have too many good players here. And I think because of the particular way the veterans you're talking about got to the team, I think that's a factor too. I think that the Clippers were very purposeful and careful about how they brought these guys in. Bradley Beal, as you know, they went around, Mark Bartelstein went around and talked to a bunch of teams and really thoroughly interviewed everyone involved, and in fact, spoke extensively. The reporting is a half hour with James Harden, and James, of course, then made the pitch to Brad himself, how they're going to use him exactly. So there's just no surprises there. And I certainly wouldn't be surprised if Beal starts a big section of games and then plays on the bench. I think his way he bristled at being on the bench in Phoenix had as much to do with the fact that it seemed like they were putting him there to make him angry and ask for a trade. I mean, that's all they wanted. They wanted him to ask for a trade. They kept kind of pushing him, nudging him, and disrespecting him to ask for a trade so they could get him off their books. And he just wouldn't do it. And I think the circumstances of that are part of what that bristling was. I also know, and you know this, that guys, the first time they're asked to go to the bench who are big stars really have an issue with it. And the second time are less sort of, they're more accepting. They less have an issue with it. So I think Bradley knows what his role is going to be there. And so therefore, I don't worry about that ego. And Chris Paul, I'm curious, you're more in this game than I am. I don't really do transactions. How many people, how competitive was it for the Clippers to get him? And the reason I ask that is I'm just curious what his other options were.
There were definitely teams interested at that dollar figure.
But to be a starter?
No, I'm trying to think of the teams. No, not a starter.
If you go through the process,
at least not a full-time starter. There are teams that you probably recognize that could use a veteran point guard.
Yeah, no, 100%. And by the way, I think a lot of teams should be interested in Chris, but I do wonder if you go through the process and the teams you talk to all say, we'd love to have you, but let's be honest, you're going to be coming off the bench. I think there's less ego when you pick the team you want to be coming off the bench, because you're not sitting there being like, well, the league says I should be a starter and you're not doing it. So I just don't worry about that stuff as much. And I don't know how much we're going to talk about Beal, but by the way Bartelstein handled the whole Beal situation, I think is a great advertisement for him as an agent. I don't know him that well. We don't have some relationship. This is not an ad, as they say, but I just, it's really kind of genius. I mean, the contract in the first place was, obviously made him overpaid, but he got him overpaid with a no trade clause. And then the way they orchestrated out of Phoenix to basically they still held the Suns a little bit hostage because the Suns needed to buy him out. And they were able to dictate how that worked with the least amount of losing money for Beal, and then sign exactly with the franchise they wanted after extensive interviews and scouting. So I was very impressed with all of that. And I feel like all those components and all those people, it certainly could come back to bite them. But I think it's going to work. I think they're a super interesting team. I like the roster.
It was Mark Stein that reported that Bradley Beal actually waited until July 15th to accept the buyout because on July 15th, he got a balloon payment from the Phoenix Suns. So he fairly masterfully orchestrated the making of the money for Bradley Beal, getting that cash in hand.
Can I ask you a controversial question, though?
Oh, hey, here you go.
Okay. So who is the better roster? Who do you feel better about, Lakers or Clippers? Since we're talking about roster right now.
Just because I think the Lakers stars are more durable, I'm going to lean towards the Lakers right now because I'm just sort of assuming that Kawhi misses time or has to sit out. I'm hoping I'm wrong. I'm hoping he plays 70 games and because he's fun to watch. And when he plays, he's like a top 5 player in the NBA. But I'm going to assume that he missed some games. The only thing I would push back on your optimism of the Clippers is that you're right. Depth is really important in today's NBA. But it's more than depth. It's interchangeable depth.
Yes.
Right? Like the Thunder, right. The Thunder are champions, to give examples, because when Lou Dort gets tired, Cason Wallace comes in. Mm-hmm. Or when Jalen Williams is tired, Alex Caruso comes in. You've got a whole bunch of guys that do a whole bunch of the same things. Can they say the same thing about the Pacers, too? Like they just plug and play different guys to do the same things. This Clippers team, as currently constructed, is a lot of offense, defense. And look, the one thing I worry about with them is that their identity was defense last year. They were third in the league in defensive efficiency.
Absolutely.
So when you're planning to play Chris Paul minutes, Bradley Beal minutes, if everybody's healthy, you would assume that Chris Dunn plays less minutes or that Derrick Jones Jr. plays less minutes. Like these are guys that were vital to the identity that they formed in Los Angeles. So this is going to take some creativity, I think, from Ty Lue, and it's going to take some real subjugating of egos, from some of these stars, because there are going to be minutes where they're going to need Derrick Jones more than they need Bradley Beal. They're going to need Chris Dunn more than they need Chris Paul. Like, it's just the reality of today's NBA where if Harden and Kawhi are giving you enough firepower and you want to play John Collins at the 4 because you like the lob threat and Zubac is an anchor for them defensively, he's not going anywhere. Ty Lue, I think, is going to earn his money if this team's going to be successful this year. He's going to have to really get creative in terms of what he does in the rotations and on the floor and how he manages that Clippers locker room. That's sort of my
That's
my
all
take
completely fair. Absolutely.